All right, I want to share with you some settings that I configure in Visual Studio that I recommend to new developers. This is not used for production code, but for people who are trying to learn C Sharp and how to develop in C Sharp without having to deal with 20 years worth of baggage of new language features. These settings tend to help people focus a little bit more on the core language, learning object-oriented programming, and writing methods, things like that. So let's take a look at these. These might be a little controversial, so give me your comments on the things you disagree with or agree with. But I want to share with you, what I believe is maybe helpful for helping new learners. So here I am in Visual Studio 2022, and I have some C Sharp code up. The code doesn't really matter, but I'm going to go to Tools, and then I'm going to go to Options. And inside of Options, I've got a number of settings. Now, here I am inside of Text Editor, C Sharp, Code Style, and then General, or just leave it on Code Style. And you can see, roughly what I'm seeing here. Now, I've kind of pre-configured these with my preferences for new developers. These are not necessarily my personal preferences for coding, but I'll walk you through my choices for things. So we're going to go through this bit by bit. The first section here is about this preferences on whether or not you want to use this in front of something. I used to use this a lot in front of my code just to help me trigger the tooltip, the code completion. I find this more distracts new developers than it helps. Aside from using this inside of constructors, that's usually very helpful. There's not really an option for that yet in Visual Studio, so I just generally do not prefer this in my settings. Now, next one, it's talking about predefined type preferences. This is talking about using int32 versus int. And so you generally don't see the framework types of int32 that much. So I find it very distracting to have it in there. So I like to encourage the predefined types of just int, bool, things like that at a warning level. So if you deviate from that, it'll give you a yellow warning on your sidebar. var. Var is very confusing for new developers. It's very confusing for them to read and understand. It's not something they need to understand, quite a bit. Versus some of the other things they want to focus on, such as declaring arrays, lists, methods, classes, inheritance, things like that. So again, this is for early developers. So I encourage to not use var really ever unless you have to. Okay? And you really never have to as a new developer use var. It can get a little tedious with dictionary of string keys and integer values, but thankfully there's like the target type new that helps a little bit with some of that syntax. Okay. Code block preferences. Prefer braces, yes. Very, very strong opinion on this. I've seen so many developers rely on indentation instead of curly braces. Curly braces are your friends, and as a new developer, they're really going to be your friend. They're going to help you understand your code structure a little bit more, help you avoid mistakes. Code might work fine without braces, but then you try to add another line, and it just doesn't work very well. So very strong opinion. Definitely prefer braces. Everything else, fairly standard. I do prefer the block scope namespace declarations for new developers. It tends to help them a little bit more. Personally, when I'm writing code nowadays, I tend to use the file scoped. This is not a strong preference on my behalf, so either one is fine. But you'll see a lot more block scoped stuff out there in the world from existing code. Auto properties, yes, these are your friends. These are a lot easier for new developers to understand than traditional full valued properties. Auto properties are your friends. Use them, absolutely yes. Easier to avoid mistakes. We recently got the simple using statement where I can say using, my variable, whatever, and I don't have to have the parentheses or the scope around it. I find it's a lot clearer to new developers the full syntax with the block scope because that shows them when it's actually being disposed and that it's effective inside this block. They really are very similar, but I find that for people in understanding the using statement, they tend to understand it better with the old way of doing things. Now, hash code, get hash code. Most new developers aren't worrying about that. I say, good, this is great. Prefer method group conversion. So this is talking about using console write instead of having a new lambda function here for that. New developers struggle a lot with arrow function syntax. I think it's good for them to struggle a lot with arrow function syntax. Let's not introduce excuses for when not to have arrow function syntax until they've got it down. So until you're really confident writing code like this, let's make sure you're writing it all the time. And once you're confident, then okay, yeah, we can use the method group stuff. Also, I've seen some interesting performance bugs recently, or fixes for performance bugs, where this was actually more efficient than this. Now, I believe C# 11 actually fixes this, but it was a thing for a while for Link at least. Top level statements. Microsoft has actually kind of given us these almost for teaching purposes. Let's use them for teaching purposes. This is where we're making a very simple program that doesn't have a class, or the class is really just auto-generated. Um, New learners probably not going to bump into these on accident, but they're really helpful. Parentheses preferences. This stuff can really, really, really help people, particularly the ands and ors. I can't tell you how many people I've seen mixing ands and ors, and they think it's going to work the way they want it to, and it really doesn't. Tell them to put in the parentheses for clarity at the warning or even maybe even the error level. It's going to save you a lot of time. I will always write my when I'm mixing and and ors, I will always put a parentheses in there just for my own readability, and I've been doing this for a very long time at this point. So definitely prefer parentheses for clarity, right? You don't want to have to spend some extra time thinking about things mentally when you're debugging software. Just use the parentheses in there. They're not hurting anything, and they're going to save you some time. Object initializers, I state no just because it's a little bit less syntax to have to deal with. Object initializers are really kind of the wave of the future for C#. So as you get into .NET, flip this back to yes. Same with collection initializers. But again, this is trying to minimize the cognitive load for a new developer who's trying to deal with 20 years of language improvements with C#, .NET, things like that. Okay. Simplify Boolean expressions. Ternary statements are tough. Avoiding ternary statements is a good thing. So telling someone that they can simplify Boolean's expression is great. A lot of students will still write if my Boolean is equal true. It's good for them to have that nudge, telling them like, look, you don't need to be this explicit. You can do this. You can just rely on the language features for you. But it's not a critical need either. Switch expression. Actually, I think this one we might want to keep this to no. Miss this one here in my prep. I find doing things one way is great when you're learning things. I personally like the switch expressions nowadays as a more seasoned .NET developer. But as you're learning things, let's learn things the way that you see it in the book. Let's learn things the way that you see it in existing code bases, and then baby step into the more advanced language features, which includes switch expressions. Turning this off prevents the language from the IDE from suggesting things until you're ready for them. Okay, and that's really my mentality here. Let's minimize the noise and let you focus on the basics of code until you can grow and use some of the more recent features in the language, because you really don't need them initially. Same thing with conditional expressions. These ternaries can really be distracting for new learners, and if statements and if else's are great, good practice. Tuples, your new devs aren't going to really be using tuples too much. Default, same thing. Yeah, some of these things I'm just like, okay, we're not going to be running into this too much as a new developer, but these are generally advisable things. Local function versus anonymous types. Yeah, I mean, I kind of left some of these things at just their defaults. Okay. Yeah, and here I'm hiding the index operator. So instead of using the back from one, length minus one is a great way of thinking about it. And once you're comfortable with that, then you can start using the index operator and the range operator as well. Both great new features, but again, trying to keep things simple for our new learners because there's so much baggage that we have in .NET. Tuple swap, again, probably not using tuples. Expression body for methods. So this is where we're talking about here, never versus when possible, when on single line. These Lambda expressions can really be confusing for new developers. So I personally say never on all of these things until you are comfortable with the language. I can't tell you how many students I've had get confused because they tried to use the tooltip to auto implement an interface and it's generating arrow functions for them, and they're really confused at that point. So keeping these to never really helps new developers as they are growing into things in their first month of software engineering or more, right? Again, we're talking about training wheels here. Okay? This is not maybe for your production code base, but you might want to adopt some of these things for your production code base just to keep the cost of onboarding new developers low. Expression bodies for lambdas, yeah, that's fine on a single line. And then here we are looking at unused value assignments. This one is one that we might want to actually bump up to a warning level, just so the person is saying like, hey, I declared this variable, I assigned it a value, but I'm never using it. That's almost always a bug for a new developer. Experienced developers, sometimes you might have something there just for debugging purposes, or you're forced to, discard it or whatever it might be. For a new developer, it might be good to have it as a warning. And then pattern matching. Pattern matching is great, but it's complexity we don't need as a new developer. So let's avoid it for now. Again, once you hit 6 months in, 4 months in, something like that, flip these things back to their default values. You're going to have a better time learning the advanced features of .NET, and that's fine. But as you're focusing on the beginning, it's already intimidating enough to learn programming. Let's keep it simple in your first few months. That's the mantra here. Okay, inline variable declarations. Um, we want to try to keep things as simple as possible. So here we're looking at actually just declaring your variable here instead of here, and that's just a better experience for your new devs. Null checking. I frankly hate this way of doing a null check. It doesn't read well to me as an experienced developer, so I prefer this anyway. Come at me in the comments, it's fine. I'm just trying to do what I can to help new developers get into .NET. See, coalesce. So here, this is what I'm borderline on. If you don't think it's going to be a lot of complexity to add in the coalesce expression for people, okay, cool. It's not that much more syntax. Null propagation, same thing. Very similar types of syntax. So we could use either one. These are not ones that I feel very strongly about. Right? Anything in null expressions, except for the prefer throw exception, I hate that. Using statements. The default place you'll see it is outside the namespace. I really have never encountered it inside a namespace before. Outside's fine. In fact, more nowadays, I'm looking at global using statements in a single file in your project. Structs and fields. Read only is one that I am sometimes hesitant to teach new learners because it's not core to what they're doing, but it really doesn't hurt them that much to be bumped into it, right? So the alternative would just be to not suggest it, but I think it's fine to suggest. It can confuse people. The other one that really confuses people is static. People have a lot of trouble learning and understanding what static is. There's a lot of things that will push people towards static for slight efficiencies. In my experience, that's leading students down paths where it's harder for them to recover because now they can't deal with your properties and fields and things like that, and they don't understand necessarily why. So static, in my experience, has caused a lot of people more pain than it's worth. But again, once you get a month or two in, start playing with static. That's fine. Same for warning on unused parameters. That's usually a bug for a new developer. It's good to have some sort of aggressive level of pointing it out to them. Line preferences, I don't believe I tweaked at all. And these are kind of the built-in general preferences. I have a few other preferences I prefer. In naming, I prefer to bump these severities up to warnings. So interfaces should begin with I, that's the standard in .NET. Types and non-field members should both be Pascal case. When students make mistakes on these, it tends to bite them later on. So this is really my stance on this. These are kind of what I espouse as good or candidate good settings for your new developers. One final thing that I want to show you is that if you don't want to have people configure their machines individually, you can actually just create an editor config file from your settings by going to the code style, clicking on the button, and it just lets you create an editor config file, and you check that into source control, and your team has it, and it just automatically moves your project just to those suggestions. Again, this is not what I would suggest for a production project, but for new learners, for something intended for new developers, this hopefully will help you. Hopefully you got some value out of this. If you think of other settings that I haven't considered here that might help new developers learn C# easier, please let me know. This is the stuff I'm passionate about. I really want to learn a little bit more. I don't view these as perfect, but I want to get a conversation started, and I want us to be thinking about the price our new language features has on our new developers. So thanks. Happy coding. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you thought.